Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are opening the hood on the American legal system. And I don't mean we're just checking the oil.
No.
We are taking the engine apart piece by piece to understand why it runs the way it does.
And specifically, we are looking at a very particular, very persistent glitch in that engine. We're talking about the relationship between the Constitution, federal power, and racial violence.
Correct. We are basing this deep dive on a really landmark text, Black Resistance, White Law, A History of Constitutional Racism in America by Mary Frances Berry.
Now, before we jump in, I think it's important to set the stage a little.
Okay.
Usually when we learn about civil rights or American history, we get the heroes and villains version. You know, the drill. They're bad guys in white hoods, good guys marching on bridges, and eventually the government passes a law and the bad guys lose.
Right. That's the comfortable narrative. It frames racism as a problem of bad apples or, specific evil individuals. But Mary Frances Berry, and we should say she's a historian, a lawyer, and the former chair of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. She is not interested in bad apples. She is interested in the barrel.
She's looking at the system itself.
Exactly. This is a systems analysis. The core question we are grappling with today is this. How is it possible that a constitution, which eventually included the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments laws explicitly written to guarantee freedom and equality, how did it consistently fail to prevent racial violence for over a century?
It's a massive contradiction. I mean, you have the supreme law of the land saying equal protection, and then you have 100 years of lynchings, riots, police brutality, where the federal government just shrugs.
Well, Berry's thesis is that this isn't an accident. It's not a mistake. It is a feature of the structural design.
A feature, not a bug.
Precisely. She argues that the Constitution has historically served two very distinct functions. It acts as a shield to protect white violence from federal interference, usually by hiding behind states' rights, and it acts as a sword to ruthlessly suppress Black resistance.
So just to make that concrete, if a mob burns down a Black neighborhood, the feds say,
sorry, that's a local matter. Our hands are tied. Can't touch it.
But if Black people arm themselves to defend that neighborhood,
then the feds say, this is an insurrection, and they send in the army.
that is a heavy pivot. And we're going to map this system out from the very beginning all the way up to the modern era.
And to do that, we have to start way back. I mean, before the Constitution was even ink on parchment, we have to go to the colonies.
Okay, take us back. Because Berry argues that this whole shield and sword dynamic isn't uniquely American. We actually inherited it from the British.
We did. It all starts with the concept of federalism. Now, in Civics 101, we learned that federalism is just the division of power between the central government and the local government.
Right. The feds handle war and currency. The locals handle, garbage collection and police. It makes sense. You don't want the king or the president deciding where to put a stop sign in Virginia.
On the surface, it's just efficient. The British Crown, for instance, did not want to pay for a standing army in every single village in the colonies. It was just too expensive.
Sure, a budget decision.
Exactly. So the policy was home rule. Local officials were responsible for their own defense and their own police matters. The Crown would only step in if the locals were completely overwhelmed.
Okay, that sounds reasonable enough.
It does, but then you apply that structure to a slave-holding society. Suddenly, home rule becomes a weapon. Who are the local officials in a colony like, say, Virginia or South Carolina?
The plantation owners, the white elite.
Yeah.
The people who own the slaves.
Exactly. So if a white settler attacks an indigenous person, or if a master beats an enslaved person to death, who decides if that's a crime?
The local officials, the master's friends and business partners.
And they define it as a local police matter, which means the Crown stays out of it, the shield is up.
Right.
But what happens if the enslaved population rebels? What happens if they organize and fight back?
Then the locals are definitely overwhelmed.
And they immediately cry, insurrection. They appeal to the Crown, or later, the federal government, for military aid. And that central power swoops in with the sword to crush the rebellion.
So the central government effectively becomes the insurance policy for slavery. They don't have to police the day-to-day abuse, but they guarantee the system's survival against any real revolt.
Precisely. And Berry argues we bake this right into the U.S. Constitution. We often think of slavery as a sectional issue, something the South did and the North just sort of tolerated. But Berry reframes slavery as a national security priority.
And the example she uses for this is the Seminole Wars. Now, I have to be honest, when I hear Seminole Wars, I think of a vague paragraph in a high school textbook about Andrew Jackson fighting some tribes in Florida. It's usually framed as an Indian war.
That is the standard framing, but Barry argues, very persuasively, that the Seminole Wars were actually the longest, deadliest, and most expensive Black freedom movement suppression in early American history.
Okay, you have to unpack that for me. Why a Black freedom movement?
You have to understand what Florida was in the early 1800s. It was Spanish territory, technically, but really, it was a sanctuary.
A sanctuary?
For decades, enslaved people from Georgia and the Carolinas were escaping. They weren't running north to the free states, they were running south.
Into the swamps.
Into the swamps.
Ah.
And they weren't just hiding out. They were joining forces with the Seminole tribes. They built communities, they intermarried, they established what historians call maroon communities, and crucially, they were armed.
So you have this sortified, armed, free Black and indigenous population sitting right on the border of the slave states.
And that absolutely terrified the U.S. government. It wasn't just about land expansion. It was about destroying a symbol of resistance. If that sanctuary existed, the entire plantation system in Georgia wasn't safe. It was a beacon.
So the U.S. Army goes in.
For 20 years. The Second Seminole War alone lasted 7 years. The U.S. government spent something like $40 million, which was an astronomical sum in the 1830s, and lost 1,500 soldiers.
Wait, $40 million? In the 1830s, just to capture runaway slaves?
To crush the sanctuary. You can read the general's dispatches, the congressional debates, it all centered on this. Commanders would write back to Washington complaining about the Black desperados fighting alongside the Indians. This was the full might of the federal military machine being deployed to ensure that human property could not escape.
That really, really solidifies the sword aspect of her argument. When the power structure is threatened, the federal government will spend any amount of money and lives to restore order.
But now let's look at the flip side, the shield. At the exact same time the army is hunting people in the swamps of Florida to return them to chains, what is happening to the abolitionists up in the north?
Well, they're incredibly unpopular. They're getting mobbed constantly. I know Elijah Lovejoy, the newspaper editor, was murdered by a mob.
Yes, in Illinois. Mobs were burning down abolitionist printing presses, they were beating speakers, burning down halls where they were scheduled to speak, and often these mobs were led by local mayors or sheriffs.
So the abolitionists write to Washington and say, hey, help us. Our First Amendment rights are being crushed here.
And the federal executive branch, the very same branch that's fighting the Seminoles, says, we have no jurisdiction.
No jurisdiction.
They claim that because the violence was happening within a state and it wasn't an insurrection against the government itself, their hands were tied. Federalism.
It really is a light switch. You just flip it. Click federal power is on for slave catchers. Click federal power is off F for abolitionists.
It's the selective service of the Constitution. And this brings us, of course, to the Civil War.
The great pivot.
Or so we like to think. You know, we are taught that the Civil War was the moment the government grew a conscience. But Barry warns us against viewing it that way. She talks about the Civil War paradox.
Which is?
That initially the Union fought to restore the status quo, not to change it. In the early years of the war, Union generals were actually returning runaway slaves to their masters in the border states.
Right, because Lincoln was terrified of losing states like Kentucky and Maryland to the Confederacy.
Exactly. Political stability trumped human rights. Even the Emancipation Proclamation. We need to see that as a strategic war measure, first and foremost. It was designed to cripple the Confederacy's economy and its labor force. It was a tool to win the war.
And there's a fascinating irony Barry points out about the Confederacy here, too. The South seceded to protect slavery, obviously.
Yes.
But their obsession with states' rights actually made it harder for them to keep slavery going during the war.
It's the ultimate irony. To maintain a slave system during a total war, you need a massive, centralized police state. You need to be able to move troops across state lines, you need to confiscate supplies, and you need to patrol the enslaved population, which was, a hostile population.
But the Confederate states refused to give their own president, Jefferson Davis, that kind of centralized power.
They were constantly bickering about it. The governors didn't want to send their militias out of state. So they lost the institution because they couldn't centrally manage the very thing they were fighting for while also fighting the Union.
So the war ends. The Union wins, and we enter Reconstruction. This is the period where we get the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th.
The new framework.
On paper, this changes everything. Slavery is dead, citizenship is guaranteed, due process, the right to vote. The gap between the law and reality should finally be closed.
And yet, Barry calls this period the Reconstruction glitch, because while the laws promised protection, the enforcement of those laws still depended entirely on political will, and that will was incredibly fragile.
Let's zoom in on one specific event to show exactly how this glitch worked. The Memphis riot of 1866. This story. It really shook me when I read the details in her book.
It should. It is one of the darkest moments in the immediate post-war era, and it's a perfect case study.
So set the scene for us. It's May of 1866.
Memphis, Tennessee. The city is incredibly tense. You have a large population of newly freed black people, and significantly, you have black Union veteran soldiers who had just saved the Union mustering out of service.
And they're still in uniform.
Still in uniform. They still have their weapons. And they are celebrating their freedom, their victory.
And the local white power structure, the police, the politicians, many of whom were ex-Confederates, they see these armed black men in blue uniforms, and they don't see heroes. They see a threat.
They see the world turned upside down. Friction occurs on the street. Police attempt to arrest some of the veterans. It escalates. And then the police, this is the crucial part, the police force itself leads a white mob into the black neighborhoods of Memphis.
This wasn't just a riot in the sense of chaos. It was a pogrom.
It was a massacre. Over the course of 3 days, they burned down homes, they burned down schools and churches built by the Freedmen's Bureau, they raped women, they killed 46 people, most of them black. 2 white people died, possibly from friendly fire.
Now here's the systems question.
Wow.
Where were the feds? There were Union troops stationed nearby, right?
There were a small contingent under General Stoneman. But the commander hesitated. He didn't have explicit orders to intervene in what was being framed as a civilian disturbance. He waited until the violence had mostly burned itself out.
But the real kick in the teeth comes afterwards.
Ugh.
The smoke clears, the community is destroyed, they appeal to the federal government for justice.
And the Attorney General of the United States, a man named James Speed, issues a ruling. Now remember, the Civil War just ended. Federal power is at its absolute zenith. The military is occupying the South. Speed looks at this massacre and says, nothing can be done.
Nothing can be done.
He rules that because the local courts in Memphis were technically open and functioning, the victims had to seek redress from the local authorities.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me the Attorney General looked at a city where the police force led the mob, and he said, go ask the police to arrest themselves.
That is exactly what he said. He argued that the federal government had no jurisdiction to intervene in a local crime.
That sounds insane. How could he possibly justify that legally?
He used the old shield. He argued that military tribunals or federal intervention were only for times when civil government had completely collapsed. Since the Memphis judges were technically still sitting on their benches, civil government was deemed to be intact. Therefore, the feds had to back off.
Even though the civil government was the one holding the torches.
Correct. And this ruling, this specific ruling, established the pattern for the next 100 years. Even with the new amendments, federalism was the magic word used to defer to local law and order, even when local law and order was the aggressor.
But what about Congress? Didn't the radical Republicans try to fight this? They passed things like the Militia Acts. They tried to give the Southern governors power to fight the Klan.
They did. They authorized the creation of state militias, which were supposed to include black men, to protect the new voters. But here we run into what we have to call the incentive structure.
The political cost.
Right. If you were a Republican governor in Mississippi or South Carolina in, say, 1874, you are walking a razor's edge. You need black votes to stay in power, but you are terrified of the race war narrative. The Southern Democratic press is just screaming that black hordes led by carpetbaggers are going to take over and destroy civilization.
So if you deploy a black militia to stop the Klan from murdering voters.
The press screams, race war. White voters, even some northern ones, panic. The federal government in Washington gets nervous about instability. So what did many of these governors do? They just didn't use the militias. They let them sit idle. They chose political survival over constitutional enforcement.
And then the system just gives up entirely. The Compromise of 1877.
Death of Reconstruction. The final nail in the coffin.
I feel like this is the moment where the entire 20th century was decided for millions of people. It all comes down to a backroom deal over a disputed election.
It does. The 1876 presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, was basically a tie. Disputed votes in 3 southern states. It was a constitutional crisis.
Well, they make a trade, a dirty deal.
The grand bargain.
Mhm.
The Republicans go to the Democrats and say, let us have the White House. Give us Hayes. And the Southern Democrats say, fine, but you have to pull the last federal troops out of the South. You have to let us run our own affairs.
They traded the safety and constitutional rights of 4 million black citizens for the presidency.
They prioritized the reunion of white America, North and South, over the rights of black America. The troops left. The Redeemers, the white supremacists, took back the state governments through violence and fraud, and the long night of Jim Crow began.
This ushers in what Barry calls the law and order era, from 1877 up through the 1900s. And this is where the legal gymnastics get really impressive or depressing. Both, I guess.
It's the era of what she calls selective federalism. This is a key insight from the book. You know, we often hear that the federal government was weak in the late 19th century. That is simply not true.
Right, because the Supreme Court was finding federal power everywhere else.
Everywhere commerce was involved. The Supreme Court was using the Commerce Clause to regulate lotteries. They were regulating the color of oleomargarine crossing state lines. They were sending in federal troops to break up strikes, like the Pullman strike.
But when it came to lynching, when it came to a mob of hundreds of people publicly torturing and murdering a black man.
Helpless, no jurisdiction. There is a specific case, Barry Sykes, that just drives this home with a sledgehammer. Hodges v. United States in 1906.
Okay, walk us through Hodges.
So a group of white men in Arkansas used violence and threats to terrorize black sawmill workers, forcing them to break their employment contracts and flee the county.
So they're being denied the right to work.
The federal government actually tried to prosecute these white men. They made a pretty clever argument. They said, hey, this is a badge of slavery. You are forcing these men into a condition of servitude by denying them the basic right to work. That violates the 13th Amendment.
That seems like a really logical argument. The 13th Amendment isn't just about chains. It's about the status of being free, which includes selling your own labor.
The Supreme Court said no. They ruled that the 13th Amendment only covered direct, literal enslavement. And crucially, they ruled that the federal government could not police private violence between individuals.
Private violence. A mob action is private violence.
They essentially said, if a mob attacks you, that's just a private fight. Like a bar brawl. It's a state crime, like assault. And unless the state of Arkansas passes a law that says we hereby legalize lynching, the federal government cannot intervene.
But they know the state of Arkansas isn't going to prosecute the mob. The sheriff might have been in the mob.
The court knew that. Everybody knew that. But the legal logic provided the perfect shield. It allowed the federal government to wash its hands of the blood.
This distinction, private versus state action, becomes the ultimate excuse. And we see the horrific consequences in events like the East St. Louis riots of 1917. This is during World War I.
This is a brutal, brutal event. It started as a labor dispute. Black workers were brought in from the South to work in factories, some as strike breakers. White resentment just boiled over.
And it exploded into a massacre. White mobs pulling black people off streetcars, shooting them, burning down entire neighborhoods, and the police were reportedly standing by or even joining in.
Now, Woodrow Wilson is president, the great progressive. He refuses to send federal troops. He uses the same old excuse: the governor of Illinois hasn't properly requested them. Federalism.
But the local businessmen, the factory owners, they pointed out a massive contradiction here, didn't they?
Yes. They noted that just a few months prior, during a railroad strike, the federal government didn't wait for permission. They sent in the army immediately to protect the mails and national commerce.
So let me get this straight. If workers stop a train, that's a federal emergency that requires troops. If a mob murders hundreds of black citizens, that's a local procedural issue.
Property was a national interest. Black lives were a local matter. The Justice Department even had lawyers who wanted to intervene. They dug up the old civil rights acts from Reconstruction. They said, we can use this. We can prosecute these people.
And they were shut down.
Wilson and his attorney general shut it down. They chose not to act. It was always a choice.
So as we move into the 20th century, the dynamic starts to shift a little bit, but not necessarily for moral reasons. We get the Cold War.
Right. The Cold War changes the incentive structure on a global scale. Suddenly, the U.S. is in a global public relations battle with the Soviet Union. We are trying to convince the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia that democracy is better than communism.
And it looks really, really bad when the Soviet newspapers are printing photos of lynchings in Alabama and Mississippi.
It was a disaster for the State Department. You had diplomats from African nations being denied service in restaurants in Washington, D.C. It was a profound international embarrassment.
So the executive branch, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, they start to care about civil rights. Not necessarily because they've had a moral awakening, but because it's a national security liability.
The incentive has changed. The cost of inaction is now higher.
But then we run into a new and incredibly powerful actor in the system, the FBI, and specifically J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover is the ultimate systems player. For decades, he prioritized domestic intelligence, by which he meant hunting communists over civil rights enforcement, and the double standard here is just staggering.
Explain that, because Hoover always claimed the FBI was just an investigative agency, right? He would say they weren't a national police force.
He loved to say that when it was convenient. He would tell presidents, he would tell attorneys general, we can't protect civil rights workers in the South. We can't identify the KKK members who are bombing churches. We just don't have the manpower or the jurisdiction.
We're unable. This is the same agency that was tracking suspected communists across 3 continents.
Exactly. The FBI could find a communist sympathizer in a haystack if they wanted to. They had informants in every union, every university. But when it came to white supremacists who were openly parading in their hometowns, suddenly the Bureau was incompetent. It was a lie. It was a refusal to use the capability they had.
But when black activism shifted from nonviolent civil rights to self-defense and black power,
Right.
suddenly the competence returned.
Oh, the competence roared back. After the Watts riots in 1965, Hoover declared black resistance a major internal security threat. He launched COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program.
The federalism switch we talked about flipped hard on.
They published manuals on how to prevent and control riots. They used massive surveillance, informants, dirty tricks. And this brings us to the story of Fred Hampton.
I think we need to slow down here. Because people hear COINTELPRO and they think wiretaps. They don't realize how far this went.
No, this wasn't just listening in. This was, by any reasonable definition, a political assassination coordinated by federal and local law enforcement.
Fred Hampton. He was 21 years old, chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party.
He was brilliant. He was charismatic. He was an incredibly effective organizer. He was building what he called a rainbow coalition, uniting poor blacks, poor whites from Appalachia, Latinos. He was exactly the kind of black messiah Hoover wrote in his memos that he feared.
So the FBI wants him neutralized. How do they do it?
They used an informant named William O'Neill. He had infiltrated the Panthers. He worked his way up and became Hampton's bodyguard.
And the FBI asked O'Neill for something very specific.
They asked him for a floor plan of Hampton's apartment on Monroe Street in Chicago. O'Neill drew it up. He marked where the furniture was. And he drew an X on the bed where Fred Hampton and his pregnant fiancée, Deborah Johnson, slept.
The FBI gave that floor plan to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office and the Chicago Police Department.
December 4th, 1969, about 4 o'clock in the morning, a 14-man raid team assembles. They have submachine guns, shotguns, handguns. They storm the apartment.
They didn't knock.
They came in shooting. They focused their fire on the bedroom that was marked on that map. In total, they fired somewhere between 80 and 90 shots into that small apartment.
And the Panthers?
The Panthers fired maybe 1 shot, and later forensics suggested it was a reflexive death spasm from a man who was already shot. Fred Hampton was killed in his bed. Mark Clark was also killed.
They executed him.
And then dragged his body into the hallway. The official story was that it was a fierce shootout.
Now, surely this is where the system has to break, right? You have federal coordination, local execution, a dead political leader. This has to lead to convictions.
The system worked exactly as designed to protect its agents. A federal grand jury was convened, and they found no probable cause to indict any of the police officers for civil rights violations.
No probable cause.
The Justice Department eventually settled a civil suit years and years later for wrongful death, but criminally. The system said this was necessary order maintenance.
Contrast that aggressive, lethal, detailed coordination to destroy the Panthers with the tepid, hands-tied response to the KKK bombing churches and killing children.
It proves Barry's point beyond any doubt. The system is highly effective when it wants to be. It's not about capability, it's about target selection.
This feels like the perfect time to zoom out. We've been throwing a lot of history at you. Let's do exactly what Barry wants us to do and map this system.
Let's visualize it. Imagine a big whiteboard with all the key players.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Who are the actors?
First, at the top, you have the federal executive. That's the president and the Department of Justice. Their primary incentive is political stability and holding together their electoral coalition. They don't want to alienate powerful white voters or local political leaders unless the cost of not acting becomes higher.
Okay. Next up, local law enforcement.
They are often the perpetrators of the violence, or at the very least, the enablers. They are shielded by jurisdiction. They know the feds are unlikely to step in, which creates a sense of impunity.
Then, the courts?
The courts are the gatekeepers. They interpret laws narrowly to limit federal police power in civil rights cases, like we saw in Hodges, but they interpret them very broadly for things like commerce or national security.
And finally, the black communities.
They are the variable in the equation. When they are docile or are seen to be suffering quietly, the system can ignore them. When they become resistant through protests, riots, or armed self-defense, they are reclassified as a threat to order.
And this creates the feedback loops. Let's trace those out.
Loop 1 is what you could call the tolerance loop. The federal government hesitates to act against white violence. This sends a clear signal to local actors, mobs, vigilantes, bad cops, that this kind of violence is permissible. So the violence increases.
Which leads directly to loop 2, the escalation loop.
Right. Unchecked violence and injustice eventually pushes the black community to the breaking point. Frustration boils over into resistance.
The riots, as they're always called.
Yes. And the moment that resistance happens, the system reframes the entire issue. It's no longer about rights. It's about order. The resistance is labeled disorder or rebellion or insurrection.
And that justifies the federal government finally stepping in, not to solve the original injustice, but to crush the resistance with overwhelming force.
Federalism is the switch. It's the mechanism that operates the gate.
Right.
For white violence, the switch is O-off-F. It's a state issue. For black resistance, the switch is on-N. It's a national safety issue.
That is incredibly depressing. But it explains so much. It explains why we see the National Guard deployed for a riot, but not for a lynching bee.
It explains how the system can claim to be constitutional and following the law while producing wildly unequal outcomes. It's following its own internal design.
And Barry brings this right up to the present day. Well, her present day, the 1990s, the Rodney King era.
She argues compellingly that the 1990s reflected the same structures as the 1890s. The blue wall of silence among police replaced the lynch mob, but the federal response remained troublingly similar.
We have to talk about the legal hurdles here, because people always ask, why didn't the feds just charge the officers involved in the Rodney King beating or any police shooting today?
They tried. After the state acquittal, the federal government did bring charges, but they ran headfirst into the specific intent barrier. This is critical to understand. This is the legal mechanism that protects police from federal prosecution.
Explain this to me like I'm 5. What is specific intent?
Okay, let's use a simple traffic analogy. Imagine you run a red light and you smash into my car. You are liable for the damage. You might get charged with reckless driving. The law doesn't care what you were thinking in that moment. You ran the light, you hit me. Simple cause and effect.
Right, your actions have consequences.
But under the main federal civil rights law, a statute called Section 242, to convict a police officer, the government has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer had the specific intent to deprive the victim of a known constitutional right.
Wait, so using the car analogy,
It would be like saying you are only guilty if the prosecutor can prove that in the split second before you hit the gas, you thought to yourself, I am now going to smash into this car specifically because I want to violate this driver's constitutional right to travel freely on public roads.
that's impossible to prove. You can't read minds.
Exactly. And a defense attorney for a cop will always say, my client wasn't thinking about the Constitution. He was scared for his life. He was trying to subdue a suspect. He was following his training.
So the juror thinks, well, maybe he was just scared. Maybe he was just angry. I don't know if he was sitting there thinking about the 14th Amendment.
And so they acquit. Barry cites a Justice Department report from that era where out of 52 federal prosecutions for police brutality, there were 46 acquittals.
That's almost a 90% failure rate.
That is a system designed to fail. It sets the evidentiary bar so impossibly high that almost no police officer can ever be convicted federally for excessive force.
And then the cycle repeats itself perfectly. The violence occurs on the videotape. You get a local acquittal in Simi Valley. Riots ensue in Los Angeles, and then the federal troops are deployed to crush the riots.
The system prioritizes order over justice every single time.
This really connects back to the whole point of our channel, to crisis and perception.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Because we tend to view these events, Rodney King, Memphis 1866, Fred Hampton, George Floyd, as fragments. We see them as bad apples or isolated incidents or crazy times. We treat them like disconnected tragedies.
But when you look at them through Barry's systems lens, they aren't isolated at all. They are the predictable output of a machine doing what it was built to do for a very long time.
The fragmentation is the crisis in perception. The system is designed to make the lack of federal intervention look like respect for the Constitution or judicial restraint. It hides the choice being made. It makes the allocation of power and protection look like inevitable neutral law.
It makes you wonder, and this is the thought I'm left with after this whole deep dive.
Go on.
If the government has a monopoly on military power, and it consistently uses that power to protect its friends, the political majority, and suppress its enemies or
Right.
ignore its vulnerable, can legal reform, just changing the words on paper, actually fix this? Or is the structure itself the problem? Does the machine need to be redesigned?
Well, Barry's conclusion seems to suggest that as long as the incentive structure remains aligned with the status quo, the Constitution will continue to be interpreted in this way. Rights exist on paper, but protection, real protection, depends on incentives and on who the system perceives as a threat versus who it perceives as a citizen to be protected.
That is a lot to chew on. We went from the British colonies to the LAPD, and the line connecting them is much straighter than I'm comfortable with.
It is a history of constitutional racism. Not just racism in America, but racism by way of the Constitution's interpretation and application.
We want to give full credit to the source of this incredible analysis. The book is Black Resistance, White Law by Mary Frances Berry. If you want the full details, the legal citations, the deep documented history, you really need to read this book.
It is an essential text for understanding how we got here.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.